This is not a capitalism versus communism issue. It's an issue of commodifying chickens. This is part 3 of my response to this video from Thought Slime. So if you haven't seen part 1 and part 2, obviously, watch those first.
She stresses that communism has always failed without really going into detail about what that means. You know, like, what does it mean for an economy to fail? Does she mean that so-called communist countries always give in and go back to capitalism?
Yep, that's what I mean.
Because if we accept that countries like the Soviet Union or Maoist China are communist, as she does, then no. There are plenty of countries that are still ideologically communist.
These countries do not have communist economies. There are only 4 that are nominally communist: China, Laos, Vietnam, and Cuba. Maoist China was arguably communist, but since opening up to the West over 40 years ago, it's been moving away from Maoism to Confucian capitalism. Now, China has recently made a turn back to Maoist authoritarianism, the ideological communism he seems to be celebrating. I don't know, I don't really think that's something to celebrate.
China, one of the only 2 communist countries she gave examples of, I just have to keep stressing that, has the 2nd largest GDP on Earth.
I didn't think I need to, but I guess I should have specified GDP per capita. If you have a GDP of $14 trillion, but a population of 1.4 billion, that's obviously falling short at 10,000 per person. To be even more specific, we have to look at GDP at purchasing power parity. China ranks in at a pretty dismal 100th place. Not that it matters, it's irrelevant to the discussion because, again, China doesn't have a communist economy. If we look at the 3 other nominally communist countries, we have Cuba at 130, Vietnam at 146, and Laos at 152. So out of 225 countries, all 3 fall into the bottom half. Now, obviously, there are a lot of confounding variables no matter what country we're talking about and no matter what economic system, but we're not just talking about evidence against communism, we're talking about lack of evidence for it. Even countries that are kind of trying at communism are incredibly poor, much more so than we would expect if the effects were random or beneficial.
Even if it did have a bad impact on GDP, who fucking cares? Fuck GDP. All my homies hate GDP. Gross domestic product is a measure of the total amount of money in a country. That's not a country's good economy score. If one person in the Republic of Fartbutt has $22 trillion and the remaining 10 million people had literally no money whatsoever, Fartbutt would have the world's highest GDP and the world's highest GDP per capita.
That's not what GDP means. It's not how much money is in a country, like being hoarded by the wealthy, it's how much money is being spent in the country. So if there was one incredibly wealthy person hoarding all the money and 10 million people with no money, then the GDP would be 0. If the country had a GDP of 22 trillion, then that would mean that wealth is being transferred. It's changing hands by buying goods and services from people in the country. Now, if we're just looking at GDP, there is a potential exploit where 2 people could just be like trading that $22 trillion back and forth. But with purchasing power parity, we actually have to look at the value of goods and services themselves. A country with no GDP outside of some token transaction has no goods and services as a reference point. It has no economy. Purchasing power parity isn't perfect, of course, but it remains one of the best measurements of economic strength that we have. It's kind of like BMI, right? There are always going to be exceptions, bodybuilders and super short people, that sort of thing, but for most of us, it's a fairly good predictor of poor health.
When UV actually gets around to explaining why she thinks anti-capitalism is anti-vegan, it's completely incoherent. She claims that socialism renders activism pointless by reducing each purchase into an act of consumer choice, which... what?
Without capitalism, eating plant-based is just symbolic. You know, promoting personal consumer actions and boycotts and alternatives as morally meaningful makes no sense.
You're describing capitalism.
No, he just fundamentally didn't understand what I was saying. I was saying that boycotts do make sense under capitalism. It's communism where they don't make sense. Veganism only makes sense when consumer choices have moral weight through their effect on the market, and that only exists in capitalism in some capacity. Under communism, you have a planned economy. There's no market to influence, which would make eating a plant-based diet merely symbolic. The only thing you can do is petition the government to make less meat, which he kind of gets.
Maybe she's assuming that under communism the state controls production, but even if that were true, and it's not, it's the opposite of true, wrong, you might say, you could still petition the state to make more vegan shit.
The point is that actually eating or not eating the meat has no moral weight. It doesn't make a difference. Every single person petitioning the government could be a full-on carnivore. Veganism in a rational, ethical sense, as it is defined in the actual definition of veganism, is only meaningful in a market. Veganism as a boycott, as not buying animal products, only makes sense when there's money to send those signals and companies making choices based on profit. Unless you're talking about some kind of veganism based on spiritual purity, like if you believe there's some sort of evil force in the meat. If there's no money, people can do whatever they want without fear of consequences. This is why communist states become totalitarian and start cutting people's heads off when they don't do what they want them to do. They have to introduce a big disincentive once the big incentive of profit has been abolished. And there's another issue with tying communism, anti-capitalism to veganism that I didn't even touch on in my original video. There's no ethical consumption under capitalism. You've probably heard this. It's a total distortion of people's worldview of consequences. It ultimately sets up an appeal to futility in opposition to vegan consumerism. The only real criticism of my argument is appealing to market socialism, as socialism done left did. Socialism done left did. Socialism done left did. I don't know why that's so funny to me. This works as a hypothetical exception if you don't think market socialism is an oxymoron. I talk about this more in this response. But sure, if your form of anti-capitalism is market socialism, if you reject actual communism/socialism, then that could be compatible with veganism, as long as you compartmentalize all of the contradictions that market socialism seems to entail. Anyway, continuing on with Thought Slime's video, he takes things further by trying to argue why veganism entails anti-capitalism.
Absent the profit motive, why would anyone keep chickens in these dark little cages for their whole lives? Do you think people like doing that? Maybe some sadists out there do, but the reason it's the dominant way to raise chickens isn't just because the world is full of sadists. It's because it makes shitloads of money.
Regardless of money, it makes shitloads of chicken. So if your population is demanding chicken and you don't have infinite time, space, resources to produce said chickens, you're going to end up with factory farming. This is not a capitalism versus communism issue. It's an issue of commodifying chickens. In capitalism or communism, the only thing that is going to prevent this type of treatment is by making chickens not property. Nothing about communism entails respecting the lives of animals or makes it likely that they'd be treated any better.
In an economy that people have more input in, don't you think people might say, hey, I don't like the way that we torture the chickens. Stop torturing the chickens so much.
You can do that in capitalism too, and at least in capitalism, when welfare reform is passed and makes chickens more expensive, this lowers demand for chickens, thereby resulting in fewer chickens killed. In communism, if you do more welfare reform, you just expend more resources, and since nobody's accountable for it, you end up with food shortages.
If the economy were centered around human need rather than bourgeois profit, will we use 10 times the soy calories to produce 1 beef calorie? Seems to me that might strike some people as a little inefficient without the lobbying industry tipping their fingers on the scale.
If it's democratic, they'll make as much meat as people vote for. Probably why communism is innately prone to ignore people and essentially is forced to plan the economy for them. Turns out the uneducated masses, not experts in food production. Despite all of the problems with China, the Chinese authoritarian government potentially switching the country to in vitro and plant-based meats in the near future is actually a pretty amazing feature. But it's not a feature of communism, it's a feature of meritocratic authoritarianism. Not only does that clearly come with a host of issues, but authoritarianism is not usually one of the selling points of communism that communists make. So if you're going to argue that communism might be better for the animals, you really need to temper that with the understanding that it might not be best for people.
But for the people producing food, I think they'd be incentivized by basic empathy to treat animals better if they didn't have to cut costs as much as possible to deliver value to their shareholders.
He's absolutely right that they wouldn't be incentivized by profit. Other things take over. Perhaps empathy would be a consideration, but also laziness, which results in lower production. It creates an incentive vacuum that has to be filled with something. Traditionally, communists fill that with violence because it's free and they're short on resources. The bottom line is that wherever that incentive is coming from, if there is an incentive to make chicken meat at all, it's to make X amount of chicken with Y amount of resources. In some hypothetical communist society of abundance, that may be plenty of resources to not torture the chicken so much. In another, it may actually be fewer resources than are even possible to raise chickens on, forcing those workers to even more extreme measures to avoid punishment for themselves and their families. Communism doesn't magically solve the problem of commodification of living things. Regardless of the system, we need animal rights and animal welfare for that. We need to stop using chickens as food.
She spends this whole video saying we have to look at evidence. We can't reason ourselves into a perfect economy. We've got to look at the data. Well, the data's in. Looks like animals are having a pretty bad time, actually. Looks like maybe the earth might fucking die. So why doesn't that data count?
That data does count, but it doesn't tell us what to do with it. You can come up with countless speculative systems and solutions, but none of them count as good ideas until you have evidence for them being good ideas. You can say, but we should just try them, which is a terrible argument that I wholeheartedly disagree with. But even if I were to agree, we tried to do communism a few times and it didn't work. In fact, it went pretty terribly wrong due to its innate tendency to result in authoritarian regimes. Maybe we can try some other things before circling back around. Just a thought.
She talks about socialism being somehow forced on people and says that's wrong because we can't just tell people what to do. That's cruel to people, you see. So instead of telling people what to do, we should continue in an economic system where people are completely beholden to the interests of their bosses.
It's not wrong simply to tell people what to do. I never said that. What's wrong is pulling out a test tube of chemicals and saying that according to your hypothesis, it will cure all diseases, all of the world's ills, and then pouring that into the world's water supply. The issue is one of evidence and consequence. In terms of employees being beholden to bosses, that's a monopoly, and I don't think there are many capitalists who are pro-monopolies. In a free competitive labor market, it goes both ways, with employers and employees engaging in negotiation and bargaining. And just to be clear, in a capitalist society, the bosses are beholden to the interests of the market. A CEO is as much a slave as the lowest wage worker, and psychological data suggests not necessarily happier. Not saying that's a bad thing if far more people ultimately benefit from it, but this juvenile narrative of some feudal hierarchy that communists imagine just doesn't exist.
You don't think it's cruel that people without money have to freeze to death?
Cruel in what sense? Willfully causing pain or suffering? No, there's no intent there. People just fell through the cracks. We should work on fixing those cracks where we can, but that doesn't mean it makes sense or is even possible to upend everything in the process. Just because we can imagine something doesn't mean it will actually work in practice.
You don't think it's cruel that poor countries have to accept austerity measures imposed on them by rich countries or get sanctioned into oblivion?
No, it's not cruel to use pressure in an attempt to get other countries to adopt certain measures for their own good. It's very likely misguided, but not cruel.
You don't think it's cruel to live in a world where, despite producing enough food for 10 billion human beings, 11% of the 8 billion human beings on Earth are starving? Meanwhile, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos have enough money to just feed them all several times over? That doesn't strike you as a cruel system?
First, it's about 9.2% that are starving or severely food insecure, which is still terrible, but I just want to be as correct as possible. And to be clear, this number has been decreasing for decades. Second, getting food to people is just not that simple. Governments can reject aid, like if they think the GMO corn has AIDS in it. That's a real thing. Or regional wars where we can't establish safe supply lines for humanitarian aid because of blockades. Third, the mega rich don't just have this money. This is not their annual income or liquid assets that they can just spend on food. It's an estimation of wealth based on the hypothetical value of their companies if they were to sell them, assuming there was someone who wanted to buy them for that amount of money and somehow dumping all of their stocks didn't devalue them. These people are earning millions of dollars a year in income, not billions. Fourth and finally, that would be the absolute stupidest form of charity. Good, effective charities are self-sustaining, even growing. This just comes back to the fundamental misunderstanding of austerity that super duper lefty types have. Many of these super rich are actually donating a majority of their incomes, which is very different from hypothetical net worths. Now, these people are still living in mansions, multiple mansions, which, maybe not so great. It would obviously be better to live more like normal people or even just like normal rich people. Give more of those assets to charity. Now, where do you draw the line? Can they live like the lower upper class? Is that acceptable? Do they have to live like the middle class? Do they have to live like the lowest earning people? Where do you draw that line? I don't know. But maybe having multiple mansions. Point is, the disparity between what they give and what they squander in a global sense is actually very small. And keeping money in a company isn't hoarding in the way that keeping it in a giant mattress is. And taking it out can be seriously harmful to the economy at large, as well as the people who work for the company, from managers to janitors.
You don't think it's cruel to just look at the system we have and say to yourself, well, it's the only thing that we know works. Works for who?
Works, period. As a functional economic system. Last time I checked, magic was not an alternative. And as we reform it, it's working better and better. Again, undernourishment has been falling for decades. Countries are constantly developing. They're moving toward democracy. They're getting running water. Exceptions to this would be those under communist ideologies who tend to move in the opposite direction.
I'm not exaggerating when I say that she considers capitalism to be the default state of human affairs. Anything which happens under capitalism is just how things are, and anything which happens under anything else represents a disruption. Capitalism is the control group against which all other economies are to be measured.
Yes, obviously what exists is a control group versus whatever speculative system you want to make. Obviously you need to compare the new to the old to see if the new is actually better before just upending things. Like how we compare medicine to the default course of the disease to make sure that it doesn't actually make things worse, or how we compare new medicine to old medicine to make sure it's actually better. I wonder if communists being so careless is a result of having such a dystopian view of the world.
And looking over the data that we do have, it seems to be Armageddon!
Thinking that things just can't get any worse. They treat the world as if it's like a terminal cancer patient in extreme agony with no known treatments. I don't even know how to begin to address that point of view. Things can and have gone terribly wrong, and they can absolutely be worse. Meanwhile, our current track is not terminal, it's ever improving. Even climate change is not hopeless.
Capitalism represents like a 200-year blip in a 20,000-year history of humanity.
The oldest surviving manufactured currency is 5,000 years old. People have used valuable items like shells and other crafted but non-fungible goods as currency for far, far longer, well before recorded history. If you want to make the argument that money doesn't equate to capitalism, I'd say you're shooting yourself in the foot. But there are smoking guns of capitalism almost as old in the form of financial records of loans. Are we really going to argue that lending isn't the intrinsic constituent of capitalism? I guess you could assert that interest has to be charged. Well, we know that goes back to before the Code of Hammurabi, which codified acceptable interest rates 3,770 years ago. Human history is defined by a history of economy, which is a history of capitalism, because resources and ownership have inherent value to the means of production. Capitalism didn't only start existing once people started calling it capitalism.
Oh, sorry, everybody has to continue being an underclass so that a few billionaires can get half of the money on Earth. We just don't know what would happen otherwise.
Consistently, I've talked about reforms and policies that could make things better, things that have evidence behind them, but, you know, I know it's easier to just pretend I said communism bad, capitalism good.
Well, we don't know what would happen if we stick with capitalism either. And looking over the data that we do have, it seems to be Armageddon!
First, that's kind of insane. And second, good thing I'm not an anarcho-capitalist who opposes all environmental regulation.
She ends her video by claiming she does not have an ideology. She says that she's not committed to capitalism or neoliberalism, by which she means social democracy but doesn't know it.
I'm far more center of social democrat, but if that's the word he wants to use, if neoliberal is just too triggering, okay. I don't have any political ideology. I'm not, fervently pro-capitalism. I'm not committed to that. I'm not even committed to neoliberal. It's just kind of the closest descriptor to what I currently believe in terms of politics. I think the only kind of label I fervently defend for myself would be consequentialist. But I am definitely anti-capitalism and communism.
Oh no, I'm not pro this thing. I'm just adamantly against being against it, which is different.
I'm adamantly against any ideology that would put people at risk by employing untested economic and political models. That doesn't make me committed to capitalism in the same way I'm not committed to atheism. There just isn't any evidence that would lead me to believe in God. If that evidence came around, okay, sure. It would be weird. I wasn't raised with any sort of religion or belief in any sort of deity, but okay. The difference is that most people today, most religious people, at least out here in the US, they mostly leave other people alone. They're not trying to make like a Christian state. Communists, on the other hand, want to implement an economic system, one that has never worked and that even in theory is inherently prone to abuses and to authoritarianism. I'd be pretty anti-Christian too if most of them were still advocating the whole holy war thing and like killing heretics. We're talking about faith-based positions that put others in danger. If you want to call being opposed to that an ideology, okay, sure. So that is totally it. That was the last part, my final response to Thought Slime's video. I hope those of you who asked for it enjoyed it, got something out of it. If not, I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. You watched a lot of stuff and didn't get anything out of it. But thank you for watching all the way through, I guess. You're a real trooper. Speaking of, I watched Super Troopers. Would not recommend. I remember kind of liking it as like a teenager or preteen, I guess, when it came out. Man, it does not hold up well. Evil Shenanigans is still very funny. That's pretty much it. And battery's about to die. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, consider liking it. Consider hitting the bell for notifications. Consider subscribing. Consider supporting the channel. Patreon.com/unnaturalvegan. I post 2 exclusive videos there for $5 plus patrons. I have shirts if you're interested. I have an Amazon store page. I need to add my cool fan to that. And yeah, thank you so much again. New video soon.